Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Masculine Mastery, the show where we talk about things that matter to men. I'm your host, Dr. Asif, and with me from sunny North Yorkshire is Steve Phillip, who is the founder of Jordan Legacy, named after his beloved son, who passed away just before COVID in 2019, and is also a mental health campaigner, particularly with suicide prevention and the devastating familial impact that has on those left behind. Steve, welcome.
Yeah, welcome, Ashley. Thank you for that introduction. And you're right, the sun is shining in North Yorkshire, which we haven't seen much of in recent weeks, but today we're blessed with it. But no, thank you. Great to be on the show.
Yeah, it's been a very wet July, hasn't it? And June was good, but certainly I went to York about 2021, just after COVID, and went up to the shambles and the cobble streets of York. So I do like North Yorkshire, and like I said to you off air, my heart is left in North Yorkshire. I spent 5 years there, all across Bridlington, Scarborough, Whitby, Ripon. I know that area very well, and it's good to have you on. And how have you been?
Not at all good. I have an amusing story to share about Yorkshire that I actually caught on the BBC News this morning, and it turns out that our big Yorkshire Water Company have just launched a promotional video about Yorkshire. But it has been noticed that the images of the Yorkshire Fells are actually the Malvern Hills. The car driven by a family is a left-hand drive, and apparently that was filmed in Ukraine. And the bar that is supposed to be a Yorkshire bar is in fact a bar in Russia near the Black Sea. So,
oh my God,
interesting tourist approach by Yorkshire
yeah,
Water.
Absolutely. It's happened a lot of times with big companies. They just seem to be so tone deaf. And there was a couple of years ago where they had a picture of what was supposed to be Romelu Lukaku for Manchester United, but it was Stormzy, and various things that have happened. They've had different people on who shouldn't have been on, etc. And yeah, sometimes, like I say, tone deaf. A lot of these big institutions. But speaking of big institutions, I read your LinkedIn bio, and you worked in the corporate world. You worked as a coach. You worked with performance, transformational leadership. Can you take me through your kind of professional life, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of left school many centuries ago with no real huge qualifications. I found myself really falling into the automotive industry. I got into car sales really, and found my way reasonably quickly as a young man into management, and then spent a good 20 years in that industry, both in the UK and in North America, where I ran a couple of General Motors franchises in Canada. We came back to the UK in the late 90s when Jordan, my son, and Daniel, my daughter, were still relatively young, just kind of approaching early teenage years. And found myself in the world of consultancy, predominantly in the automotive industry at that stage, and then moved into leadership and management training within that sector. Around about 2008, 2009, with a lot of interest in professional coaching and went through the coaching academy to get a qualification. I decided to leave a fairly well-paid director's role and company car and all that came with it within the leadership and management training company I worked for, and set up my own coaching practice just as another recession hit the UK. Maybe not the best of decisions. But someone at that time said, look, I know you're looking for coaching clients for your new business. Have you thought about LinkedIn? I had no idea what LinkedIn was. I clearly wasn't, even back then in 2009, a millennial. So I wasn't a real social media user. But I found LinkedIn. I kind of engaged with it, found it a great tool to network with. And the short story is, within 12 months, I founded a consultancy practice called Link to Success. And for the next 11 and a half years, basically went into companies and organizations, coaching and speaking on how to get the most from social media platforms like LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter,
Mhm.
and Instagram, and that was really my career up until the moment, as you mentioned, when very tragically my son Jordan took his own life on December the 4th of 2019.
Yeah, so that we'll get onto that in a second because it seems like your life is almost in two halves. As in, you had the pre-Jordan life, pre-2019 life, and then the second part. And again, it's been one hell of a journey. So from the corporate world, working for someone, then working for yourself, and then finding a non-profit like Jordan Legacy. So I just wanted to speak about um, LinkedIn because you've amassed quite a following, 50,000 followers. And as that, and you know, you're one of LinkedIn's, you know, so-called big voices into, or I don't know what they call it, top voices or whatever. I think there's actually a name for it, but you know, certainly you come up on my feed a lot. And I thought I need to reach out to Steve because he talks about a lot of things from personal experience that I only talk about from my experience as a doctor. I talk about it professionally. I see the other side of the spectrum, if you know what I mean. I sit on the other side of the table, but you've sat on the other side of the table where you've actually personally been affected, and that's why I thought I'd reach out to you. But a lot of people have gone through grief, but they're not as vocal as you, and I think it's so important to leverage social media. It's at our disposal. It is with social media, particularly LinkedIn. You can make the whole world into a village just like, you know, when you were growing up and I was growing up in the 90s, you know, you had a local village pub and, you know, everyone knew each other. But social media, you can make 6 billion people into your local village pub just by the facts of connecting, etc. So, you know, I do take my hat off to you and salute you for doing such a impressive job. Consistency and persistence and great content, you know, that's very, very engaging. So in 2000 19, you mentioned December 4th, just before COVID. You probably heard about COVID then. It was like a variant in China. I never thought it'd come to the UK. I remember working 2019. I was working in Nottingham at the time, and we heard about this Wuhan virus. Probably November 2019. Didn't think much of it, and you know, so December 2019 again. You know, there were just some ripples in the air about COVID and the Wuhan virus. We hadn't even given it a name yet. So let's go back to December 3rd, Steve. I know you've been asked this question before. December 3rd. When was your last conversation with Jordan?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, I look back to that time, and just to wind back very briefly to, you know, when you made the comment about my kind of life in two halves almost. One of the things that has happened is that a lot of the skills and abilities and experience of social media and LinkedIn and my leadership and management and professional coaching in a very strange way somewhat prepared me for what I do now. So I think that is kind of an important transition to mention. But yeah, December the 3rd, you know, I just delivered a talk to a large hotel group in Newcastle upon Tyne, up in the northeast of England. Got in my car, drove then to the Midlands, down in Solihull and in the West Midlands there, where the following day I was working with International Motors Group. I was there to deliver a Facebook workshop to a lot of their senior managers that were there. And I'd arrived at my hotel quite late on December the 3rd. That evening, Jordan and I had suggested we would chat. We knew he was struggling at that time. And I messaged him and said, look, just going to go down, get a bite to eat in the restaurant, George. Should we have a conversation afterwards? And this was all on WhatsApp.
Mm-hmm.
And his reply, you know, essentially was to say, yeah, sounds like you've had a long day, Dad, and all that. Look, I'm just kind of feeling a little bit tired. Don't worry too much tonight. We'll kind of catch up another time. I just feel like I'm probably going to go to bed. I've had another bad night the night before, and I'm just going to go to bed and chill. And that was my last conversation with Jordan. It was a WhatsApp interaction, something I've documented and shared very openly on LinkedIn with a screen grab of the kind of last part of that conversation. But that was it. No inkling that what was to come the following day would happen at all.
Gosh, so I have seen that a lot because I worked on the other side of it. I've seen people put into A&E in resus who have ended their life with at their own hands, and then they still have to come to hospital because we still have to. We don't know the time of death, so we have to assume they are still for resuscitation. So I've seen the end of that, and then I've always spoken to the relatives, usually a girlfriend or the mother, and said, "Did you have any inclination at all beforehand?" And 90%, Steve, I would say no. We know they were struggling, but we didn't know that this was the straw that brought the camel's back. So you said just before you mentioned the WhatsApp conversation, you mentioned Jordan, you knew he was struggling, and I know you said something about he had I've read his bio partner, and then he had a pet cat, I believe. A nice little family of three. So, was there any inclination before he got diagnosed with anxiety? I believe in his late 20s. Was there any inclination that week or that month? I know people suffer from seasonal affective disorder from September onwards. They get low in mood. It happens to me. It happens to a lot of people where mood does dip from September to March, particularly in December. December and January are the worst months of mental health, and that can again be related to sunlight exposure, vitamin D deficiency. There's actually a medical reason for that. But the weeks preceding December the 4th, was there an inclination that his mental health has got slightly worse?
Yeah, this is something we've looked back at many times, and if we look at the series of events and leading up to that, and just to kind of put into context, when Jordan was first diagnosed, you're quite right to say late 20s, around about 30 years old, with clinical anxiety and depression. His support process via the GP was to be referred for cognitive behavioral therapy, a series of 14 weeks, and nothing he discussed with us really. We knew he was going, but he was an adult, had his own house, and so we never got into the depths of what those conversations were about. He was also prescribed antidepressant medication. Initial medication didn't really suit him, so that was changed. And his journey after that was one really, as it started to come back to us after a very low period when he was first diagnosed, was that he got on with his life and his career, and whenever he felt he was his depression and anxiety was taking over again, he would go back for a further prescription of antidepressants. So no other talking therapy, no other support mechanisms. Very typical man in many respects. I will self-manage this, and he did. To the outside world, he did. We now know from having read his journals, which we found in his house subsequent to his death, that he clearly wasn't managing. That there were clearly a lot of issues there. Even, in fact, we got to understand what was discussed at his CBT sessions as well around body dysmorphia, something we had no idea about at all. So in the weeks leading up to Jordan's death, yes, we knew he was struggling. Yes, his girlfriend, Charlotte, who had a base in Sheffield, but would come and stay with him in Leeds. We were in touch. His mother and I, we divorced, separated in 2005, but have always remained very, very close. We were in regular kind of contact with each other. Independently, we would phone Jordan or message, see how he was doing. So we were aware that he wasn't in a good place again. He did go and visit the GP around about 11 days before his death for a further prescription of antidepressants. And having spoken with the GP after Jordan's death and asked very specifically, the GP said there were no obvious signs there that Jordan was suicidal. In fact, he asked Jordan the question, are you considering suicide? And Jordan's response was no. However, what was really telling to me was that when we discussed how Jordan presented during that GP's visit with the GP, he did say that Jordan was very upset and in tears during that conversation. Now, wind back the clock to those almost 4 years ago now, my knowledge of mental health and suicide was pretty well 1 out of 10. I'm probably being kind to myself there. And you kind of look back on that and think, well, you had a son with clinical anxiety and depression. Should you have known more? Really simple answer to that question: yes. That's it. Yes. And that's a message really to everyone
Yeah,
out there. Learn whatever you can do. But we certainly had no inclination that Jordan was considering that. But when you hear of a 34-year-old man who is in tears in front of the GP, you start to question whether simply signing over a prescription for antidepressants and, by the way, here's a card with a phone number to mind, is enough of an action.
Mm-hmm.
And I've come to fully understand the pressures that the NHS system is under, that GPs are under with their 6-7 minute appointment windows. We know it's a system issue. It's not that people don't care at all. But from our point of view, suicide never crossed our mind, or certainly not my mind. I don't know about any of the other family members, but it's not something that's ever been openly discussed that anyone else thought for one moment that Jordan might take his own life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because you think on the surface, and you mentioned, I've seen the pictures, good looking lad, prime of his kind of youth, 34 years young for a guy. Girlfriend, seems happy, content with his great own house, which is very difficult, by the way, at that age. And close to his parents, in communication with both of them, friendship group, like you said, and some of the memorials, the comments from his friends at the funeral and thereafter about how he was and the light of the party, and you wouldn't add two and two together, and on the and this is what I find in a lot of my coaching clients, and when I worked as a doctor, see a lot of men in their 30s and 40s. It's a thing of inside they might be really, really struggling, but they are so good at putting on a mask. And actually, 2 years ago, a Martin Kemp's son, that you might have seen that documentary was fantastic because he talks about his friend who worked in radio with him. And the day before, in August 2020, so less than a year after Jordan, one of Roman Kemp's friends, similar story, as in he was struggling on tablets, but nobody knew. Literally nobody knew that. Gary Speed's another example as well. I remember watching Football Focus that same day. And I got a text from my friend. He actually phoned me, and I was a medical student then, and I thought something had happened. And he phoned me in panicking because he's like, I said, we literally saw Football Focus at 12:30 and the same day. And that really sparked my interest in mental health. And I wanted to do psychiatry thereafter because I thought, gosh, things we can see like ECG, we can see heart problems, we can do an X-ray, we can do a blood test to look for deficiencies, ailments, physical ailments. But for mental health, we cannot see. Even an MRI of the brain, actually, you won't be able to see. You can do a blood test and you can't measure levels of serotonin, or you can't measure anything like that. You measure, levels of dopamine, etc. So there's actually no way to find out other than speaking to the person, and that again is contingent upon what they devolve to you. What they say to you, that's contingent. And women because women are more right side brain, they are more emotive in their language. Men are more left sided with their brain, more logical and rational. And he might have thought, you're my father, there's nothing that you can do to help me with this pain. You want a psychiatrist, etc. And this is a logic. I'm speaking from a patient point of view. This is the logical side of men's brains. You're my employer, or you might be my father, you might be my best friend. But actually, there's nothing that you can do. Even you're my GP. There's nothing that you can do to solve this pain. I'm taking tablets. I've had 14 weeks of therapy, talking therapy, CBT. I've had reframing and all sorts. I've got a loving girlfriend, but nobody can solve this pain. And that's what I find, even now, I've not got an answer to this. I've not got an answer to how do we get men to say, I'm struggling.
I thank you for sharing that, first of all, because I think that, that's a consideration, everything you've just described about the right and left-hand side brain, which I have a knowledge of and some experience of. It's never quite been shared in that way. And I think that is really interesting and something for the listeners to take away here, to say that we know that men are typical people, they're fixers.
Yeah.
We've got a problem, we want to fix it. And I think your description absolutely fits with that. There's nothing anyone else can do. It's kind of down to me to fix it. The reality is we're losing 6,000 plus people to suicide every year in the UK, and 75% of them are men. Of those 6,000 plus people we lose, another 20 per suicide are attempting. So clearly we're not dealing with this. We're not fixing the problem ourselves. So how do we do that? I think it is very much up to us as a society to create the environment that allows us to talk much more openly about topics that men particularly don't feel comfortable talking with. We've got to change the narrative. We've got to allow people to do this. This is historic. We know this, isn't it? It's generational. The man up thing and all these things that I am supposed to be, even in this world of equality, the person who fixes things and sorts things out. If I can't, then in some way I'm not a man. And this thinking process still goes on. If we create amongst men's groups, particularly, and look, there's some fantastic groups from Andy's Man's Club to Talk Club and all the others, that are growing now prolifically. If we can create the right environments where we say it's kind of okay to be vulnerable, it's not about being brave, by the way. That's, I think, really important language.
Yes.
It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay for us to sit in a pub while they still exist and talk about these things, as well as the football and the beer or whatever else. We've got to start creating those environments.
100% safe spaces where men, and before, and COVID happened in 2020, there were barbershops, there were pubs, etc. And that took a massive downturn during COVID. And I did see men's mental health have a massive uptick. And I worked with a Canadian group called Tether, based in Vancouver, and they were a men's mental health online forum. And you throw in three things. So it's the Northern Hemisphere weather, particularly in winter. You throw in financial constraint, COVID, and the 2008, 2009 crash, like you mentioned earlier. And then you throw in this toxic narrative we're seeing on social media as well, body comparisons, Love Island, where everyone's perfectly chiseled. And I worked in modeling now for like almost 15 years in terms of, I do a lot of catwalks and fashion shows. And the worst mental health, Steve, I can tell you, in terms of body image is in models. Low self-esteem, eating disorders, anxiety in models, and self-harm. Self-harm is so common. But going back to self-harm, you mentioned 20 to 1, and that is very, very true. Because in medicine, almost 12 years where I've worked in A&E, majority, and I would say a vast majority, 90% of suicide attempts are women, in terms of, a lot of them are cries for help. We don't know if it's actually genuine suicide attempt, but when it comes to suicide successful, men are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to commit suicide than women. And again, it goes back to the left side of the brain. Men's logically wired brain will say, you're in existential pain, you're in pain. Only way to end the pain is to end something that's causing the pain. So if your life is causing the pain, let's end the pain. And so men's, you can understand where it comes from. And even in the battlefield, many soldiers, it's called falling on your sword. It's an old expression, falling on your sword. And so women are much less likely to commit suicide, although mental health is actually more prevalent in women. So depression and anxiety is more prevalent in women, particularly borderline personality disorders, bipolar disease. It's actually more common in women than it is in men. However, suicide rates in men are almost 2.5 to 3 times as likely in men. And why is that? I mentioned that before, but also, Steve, worryingly, and Jordan fell into this demographic of I've just got a Zoom meeting notification. Jordan fell into the demographic of suicide being the biggest killer of men under the age of 40. Bigger than road accidents, bigger than diabetes, bigger than heart disease. And it's more men are dying from suicide than any other thing, and that needs to change. Like you mentioned, we need to change the narrative.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the figure being quoted particularly now, Asif, is the biggest killer of young people under 35, and the biggest killer of men, as you say, under 40. Once again, we know that it's a combination of, again, men being completers of tasks. I
Yeah,
think you're absolutely right. And we also know that as a result of that, they'll tend to choose means of suicide that will ensure that that task is completed.
yeah,
So it's typically a more violent means
yeah,
of death. So that is why we see more deaths in men. But you're absolutely right to say, from a female perspective, we see much higher rates of suicide attempts, much higher rates of depression, um, and self-harm as well. Almost 3 times higher rates of self-harm in women there as well. Interestingly, you talk about the modeling and the impact there. We know that once upon a time, eating disorders, particularly body comparisons, were very much something we looked at in women.
yeah.
We are now seeing a huge shift, and almost for the first time now, a level playing
Oh
field.
yes, yes,
Men are equally suffering with the same kind of disorders. Love Island, these images on
yes,
Instagram. I was going to, if I'd had time, I would have looked up these particular hashtags, but there are 2 particular hashtags that do the rounds on Instagram that are particularly drawn, one to draw men towards chiseled bodies and all this, and one for women. And they get hundreds of thousands of
mm.
hits and followers that this is what I should look like. And going back to Jordan's story, the thing we didn't know about, and only by after his death, when we were going through his attic in his house and boxes of possessions, did we find all his notes and information from his CBT sessions some 4 or 5 years earlier. And as we read those and saw the drawings Jordan had made within the notebooks, we realized that the reason why he'd gone for this CBT and the cause of his anxiety and depression at that time was a form of body dysmorphia.
Mm.
This was essentially, let's call them spots or marks around his body that certainly were not really that visible to everyone else, but to the extent that he would not get changed in swimming pool changing rooms. He would not look at himself in shop windows when he walked past or in mirrors. He would put descriptions of how he would essentially pick at these. And part of his CBT was to stop him doing that. And this was Jordan's impression of himself, the guy that everyone looked at and said, what a cool dude. Look how good looking he is. When he walks in that room and does his dance moves, he's the guy that everyone looks at. How I wish I was like Jordan.
Yes.
And yet there, written down in his own words, was Jordan, or his perception of
Yeah.
himself.
And that's the almost like a dissonance we have here. We've got these guys who are admired, and we see this in TV and media. People who are admired for their beauty, for their singing, for whatever talent, but inside they've got a silent war that nobody knows anything about. And nobody will know anything about unless they get access to their journals. But oftentimes it is too late. And even I know a lot of people undergoing CBT don't divulge much information, actually. There's enough to get them some treatment and feel a bit better, but some of their deepest, darkest secrets, particularly about themselves, their image of themselves is never divulged. And that is something I'm grappling with, Steve. I'm grappling with, from a mental health point of view as a doctor and someone who's had this body image myself, and I see it in modeling. How do we get more men to talk? How do we get, and women, but particularly talking about men in this instance, because men are much more likely to commit suicide. And it's suicide prevention, which really is the crux of the thing I'm grappling with. Because my barber committed suicide 2 years ago. Great barber, Italian guy, cut my hair. COVID happened. He opened his own barber shop. He was doing well. Next day, he's not here. And we had no, he was a big strapping lad, funny, he's from Italy originally. Had no idea. And Gary Speed, is a great,
Mm.
well, is a glaring example of that. So with Jordan's legacy now, it's been 3.5 years now. You set it up, do some great work there, raising awareness. Have you moved the needle in terms of your personal understanding of how this thing can be prevented?
Yes, I mean, this learning journey that I've been on has been phenomenal. Really, I've become a human sponge of anything to do with this. And I've been very fortunate that by being very vocal, that's attracted a lot of people with far more knowledge and experience than me to come round the table and have these discussions. In terms of kind of the work that we're doing and where I think the opportunities are, I think a couple of things just to mention, given what you've just said, particularly about men and body image and all these things. I think there's a couple of things that we need to do. I think we hear the term stigma a lot, and people don't speak up because of a perception of what others will think if they do open up, and that's just one element of stigma. We know there are cultural issues that go on, particularly in the Southern Asian community, where I have a lot of connections and speak to people there. Had an incredible conversation with a PhD doctor working in Indonesia at the moment, where they've now got suicide prevention enshrined in law in a very highly religious culture of some 280 million people. And just how they did that was quite inspiring, I have to say. But stigma is really important. So stigma, firstly, how do we get people to feel they can open up? I think we have to go right back, to quote the late great Desmond Tutu, a quote that I use a lot. We have to really stop pulling people out of the river who are drowning and go upstream and find out why they're falling in the first place. So that's the first start. Where is that first place? It's schools, it's young people, it's young men that are struggling, young boys, to find their identity at school or being bullied or whatever is going on. We have to create environments for our young people where they can express their emotions and know that it's okay to talk about emotions. So we have to go right back there and create the next generation of healthy, thriving, mentally thriving adults, and particularly men. So firstly, we need to do that. We have to look at the language around suicide, and forgive me because I'm going to pick you up on something here, if that's okay. I've heard you use the term commit suicide on several occasions during our conversation. Now, of course, that term is something I was using even after Jordan's death. But the inference in terms of using the word commit actually harks back to the fact that suicide, in fact, or to attempt to take your own life, was an illegal act in the UK until 1961.
That's right, yeah.
It still is illegal in some countries, of course. So quite often the term commit, the reason why it kind of quite often grates with people who are bereaved, is that it sits alongside commit murder, commit adultery, commit robbery. So there's a real push from all the major charities, and the media particularly have been advised to use terms such as they died by suicide, or ended their own life, or took their own life. Even completed suicide is a language that's not liked, because it's almost like it was a successful outcome. So language has become a big part as well. So if nothing else, I can share with everyone that's listening today is if we can try and move from that language to a language that is kind of easier on other people.
And it's more compassion, especially for those who are bereaved. 100%, absolutely.